Mayday, Mayday, this is Crimson Thunder. Got a situation here at mile marker 189.
The amber glow of truck stop lights cut through the pre-dawn darkness like dying stars, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt where diesel fumes hung heavy in the cool California air. Route 40 stretched endlessly in both directions, a ribbon of worn concrete that had swallowed countless travelers over the decades, though none quite like what was about to unfold in the early hours of that October morning. 43-year-old Jeremiah Caldwell adjusted his worn baseball cap and took a long sip of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The bitter liquid did little to shake the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones after driving for 14 straight hours. His Peterbilt 379, a gleaming red and chrome beast he had nicknamed Crimson Thunder, sat idling in the parking lot of Mike's 24-hour truck stop, its diesel engine rumbling like a sleeping dragon. Jeremiah had been hauling freight across the western states for over 20 years, long enough to know every truck stop, every dangerous curve, and every shortcut between Los Angeles and Denver. Tonight's load was routine. Computer components bound for a warehouse in Colorado Springs. Nothing valuable enough to attract hijackers, nothing dangerous enough to require special permits. Just another milk run that would put food on the table for his wife Patricia and their 12-year-old daughter Emma back in Riverside. The CB radio crackled to life, breaking the monotonous hum of the truck's engine. Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose looking for Crimson Thunder. You copy, Jeremiah? Jeremiah reached for the handset, recognizing the voice of Dolores Ramirez, a fellow driver he had known for years. At 51, Dolores was one of the few women who had broken into the male-dominated world of long-haul trucking in the early 80s and earned respect through sheer determination and an uncanny ability to navigate the most treacherous mountain passes in any weather. This is Crimson Thunder, go ahead, Desert Rose. Jeremiah responded, his voice hoarse from the long night. Heard you were running the same route as me tonight, Dolores said. How's that fog looking up ahead? My weather radio's been acting up since Needles. Jeremiah peered through his windshield at the thickening mist that seemed to rise from the desert floor like ghostly fingers. Getting thicker by the mile, visibility's maybe a quarter mile now. You running solo tonight? Affirm. Got a load of auto parts for Denver. Was thinking about catching some shut-eye here, but dispatch is breathing down my neck about delivery times. Same here, Jeremiah sighed. Patricia's been on me about taking more rest breaks, but the bills don't pay themselves. The mention of his wife brought a familiar pang of guilt. Patricia worked double shifts at the local diner just to make ends meet while he spent weeks on the road. Their marriage had weathered many storms over the years. The financial pressures, his prolonged absences, and the constant worry that came with loving someone who made their living on America's most dangerous highways. Well, you be careful out there. Jeremiah, Dolores continued. Something feels off about tonight. Can't put my finger on it. Jeremiah had learned to trust the instincts of veteran drivers like Dolores. On the road, intuition often meant the difference between making it home and becoming another statistic in the Department of Transportation's accident reports. Copy that, Desert Rose. Keep your ears on. 10-4, Crimson Thunder. Catch you on the flip side. The radio fell silent except for the occasional chatter from other drivers scattered across the interstate. Jeremiah finished his coffee and performed his pre-trip inspection, walking around the massive truck with a flashlight, checking tire pressure, brake lines, and cargo straps. Everything appeared secure. The computer components in his trailer were worth nearly $200,000, enough to make theft a serious concern, though the sophisticated alarm system installed by his employer Westfield Logistics provided some reassurance. As he climbed back into the cab, Jeremiah's pager buzzed. The small device displayed a message from his dispatcher. Customer requesting expedited delivery. Bonus pay available if delivered by 0800 hours. Confirm receipt. 8 hours to cover 400 miles through mountain passes and desert stretches where fog could reduce visibility to mere feet. It would be cutting it close, but the bonus money would cover Emma's school clothes for the upcoming season. Jeremiah typed back his confirmation on the alphanumeric pager and secured it to his belt. At 3:15 a.m., Crimson Thunder rolled out of the truck stop and merged onto Interstate 40 eastbound. The fog had thickened considerably, forcing Jeremiah to reduce his speed to 45 miles per hour. His headlights penetrated only a few car lengths ahead, creating a tunnel of white light surrounded by an impenetrable gray wall. Other vehicles moved like phantoms through the mist, the occasional car with hazard lights blinking, a few brave souls pushing ahead at dangerous speeds, and the steady parade of 18-wheelers that formed the backbone of America's economy. The CB radio provided a constant stream of updates from other drivers, accident reports, weather conditions, and the general camaraderie that helped combat the isolation of the long road. Eastbound traffic, "This is Moondog running mile marker 12 came a gravelly voice through the speaker. "Got a four-wheeler sideways in the median about 5 miles ahead. Smokey's on scene, but watch your speed through there." Jeremiah keyed his microphone. "Thanks for the heads up, Moondog. This is Crimson Thunder running about 10 miles back." The highway patrol cruiser's flashing lights appeared through the fog, like a distant lighthouse, warning travelers of the dangers ahead. A compact car sat crumpled against a guardrail, its hazard lights blinking frantically, while a tow truck worked to extract it from the twisted metal. Jeremiah slowed to a crawl as he passed, offering a silent prayer for the occupants while reflecting on the fragility of life on the interstate. By 4:30 a.m., the fog began to thin as the elevation increased toward the Tehachapi Mountains. Jeremiah's progress improved, and he allowed himself to believe he might make the deadline after all. The radio had been quiet for the past hour, with most drivers either sleeping or focused on navigating the treacherous conditions. Then came the call that would haunt investigators for the next 25 years. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Crimson Thunder." Jeremiah's voice crackled through the CB radio, cutting through the static like a knife. "Got a situation here at mile marker 18-9. Need immediate assistance." Dolores Ramirez, who had been running about 30 miles behind, immediately responded. "Crimson Thunder, this is Desert Rose. What's your 20 and nature of emergency?" Silence. "Crimson Thunder, come back," Dolores repeated, increasing her speed despite the fog. "Jeremiah, you copy." Nothing but the steady hiss of static filled the airwaves. Other drivers began chiming in, trying to raise Jeremiah on the radio. A driver known as Buffalo Bill reported passing mile marker 18-9 just minutes before and seeing nothing unusual. Another trucker, Night Owl, claimed to have seen taillights disappearing into a side road near that location, but couldn't be certain in the thick fog. When Dolores reached mile marker 18-9, she found only empty highways stretching in both directions. No sign of Crimson Thunder, no evidence of an accident, no indication that Jeremiah Caldwell had ever been there. The fog seemed to have swallowed him completely. At 5:17 a.m., Dolores contacted the California Highway Patrol from a payphone at the next truck stop. Officer Raymond Kowalski, a 10-year veteran of Desert Highway Patrol, took the report with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too many tragedies play out on the lonely stretches of Interstate. "Could be a breakdown," Kowalski suggested. "Driver might have pulled off somewhere to assess mechanical problems." But as dawn broke across the Mojave Desert and the fog lifted like a curtain being drawn back, search teams found no trace of the missing truck or its driver. No skid marks, no debris, no indication that Jeremiah Caldwell had ever traveled that section of highway. The investigation began immediately. Westfield Logistics reported that their GPS tracking system, a relatively new technology in 1998, showed Crimson Thunder's last known position at mile marker 18-9 at exactly 4:31 a.m. After that, the signal simply vanished. Detective Amanda Torres of the Kern County Sheriff's Department took lead on the case. A 15-year veteran of law enforcement, Torres had handled her share of missing persons cases, but something about Jeremiah's disappearance felt different from the start. In my experience, Torres would later tell reporters, people don't just vanish without leaving some kind of trail. There's always evidence, tire tracks, witness accounts, something. But with Jeremiah Caldwell, it was as if he simply ceased to exist at mile marker. The physical search expanded rapidly. Helicopters scoured the desert terrain on both sides of the interstate, looking for any sign that the massive truck might have left the roadway. Ground teams with search dogs combed through ravines and washes where a vehicle might have tumbled in the fog. The California Highway Patrol issued bulletins to law enforcement agencies across the Southwest, describing the distinctive red Peterbilt and its valuable cargo. Patricia Caldwell received the call at 7:23 a.m. from a Westfield logistics supervisor. The news hit her like a physical blow. Jeremiah had called her just before leaving the truck stop, his voice warm with promises of being home by the weekend. Now he was gone, somewhere in the vast expanse of desert that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond their small world in Riverside. He's done this route 1,000 times, Patricia told Detective Torres through tears during the initial interview. Jeremiah knows every mile of that highway. He wouldn't just pull off without radioing for help. 12-year-old Emma sat quietly in the corner of their living room, clutching a stuffed animal her father had given her for her birthday. She didn't understand why the police officers were asking so many questions, but she sensed the gravity of the situation from her mother's tears and the hushed conversations between adults. The investigation revealed that Jeremiah Caldwell was exactly what he appeared to be: a hard-working family man with no criminal history, no gambling debts, no affairs, no reason to simply disappear. His financial records showed a man struggling to make ends meet, but managing to stay current on his obligation. There were no large insurance policies, no hidden bank accounts, no indication that his disappearance was anything other than what it appeared: a man and his truck vanishing into the desert night. Fellow drivers described Jeremiah as reliable and cautious, someone who followed safety protocols religiously and never took unnecessary risks. Dolores Ramirez spoke of a man devoted to his family, who carried pictures of his wife and daughter taped to his dashboard and called home whenever possible. Jeremiah wasn't the type to just walk away from his responsibilities, she told investigators. If something happened to him out there, it wasn't by choice. Westfield Logistics offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of their truck and cargo. The reward drew dozens of tips from across the country, reported sightings of the distinctive red Peterbilt in truck stops from Nevada to Texas. Each lead was meticulously investigated and proved to be either a case of mistaken identity or an outright hoax. The computer components in Jeremiah's trailer never surfaced on the black market, despite their considerable value. For cargo thieves, sophisticated electronics were typically the first items to appear in underground networks. The fact that none of the missing computers ever appeared suggested either extremely professional criminals or something far more sinister. As weeks turned to months, the investigation began to focus on the stretch of highway where Jeremiah had vanished. Mile marker 18-9 sat in a particularly desolate section of desert, with few landmarks and minimal traffic during the early morning hours. The nearest exit was 15 miles in either direction, making it an unlikely spot for a planned disappearance. Local ranch hands reported no unusual activity in the area. No tire tracks leading into the desert, no sounds of engines or crashes during the foggy early morning hours. It was as if Crimson Thunder had simply been erased from existence. The case attracted national attention when a television news magazine featured Jeremiah's disappearance as part of a segment on mysterious vanishings along America's highways. The exposure brought new tips and renewed interest, but no concrete leads. Patricia Caldwell appeared on the program, her composure barely maintained as she made a heartfelt plea for information about her missing husband. "Someone, somewhere knows what happened to Jeremiah," she said, her voice breaking. "He's not just a statistic. He's a husband and father who deserves to come home." But as 1998 gave way to 1999, hope began to fade. The active investigation was scaled back. though Detective Torres kept the file open and continued to follow up on occasional tips. Patricia was forced to accept that her husband might never return, a devastating reality that fundamentally changed the trajectory of her and Emma's lives. The trucking community, however, never forgot. Jeremiah's disappearance became part of the folklore of the road, a cautionary tale shared in truck stops and over CB radios. Some drivers reported strange feelings when passing mile marker 18-9, a sense of unease that couldn't be rationally explained. Others claimed to hear faint radio transmissions on quiet nights, desperate calls for help that seemed to echo from the past. Dolores Ramirez retired from trucking in 2003, but she never stopped thinking about that foggy October night. She kept a photograph of Jeremiah and his family tucked in her sun visor for years, a reminder of how quickly life could change on the lonely highways she had called home for decades. "I still hear his voice sometimes," she would tell friends. "That last transmission, asking for help, makes me wonder what he saw out there in the fog, what made him so scared that he broke radio protocol to call for assistance." Patricia eventually remarried, finding companionship with a kind man who understood her need to keep Jeremiah's memory alive. Emma grew up with the shadow of her father's disappearance, a mystery that shaped her worldview and led her to pursue a career in investigative journalism, driven by a desire to find answers to questions that seemed to have none. The years passed, and Interstate 40 continued to carry its endless stream of travelers across the desert. Mile marker 18-9 became just another numbered post along the highway, noted only by those who remembered the story of the trucker who vanished into the fog. The desert kept its secrets as it had for countless generations, holding the truth beneath its silent expanses of sand and stone. But secrets, even those buried in the deepest desert, have a way of eventually rising to the surface. Sometimes it takes a generation for the truth to emerge, carried on the winds of time and revealed by the relentless progress of civilization into places that once seemed forever lost to human memory. In the end, it would take exactly 25 years, a construction project and a shocking discovery to finally shed light on what happened to Jeremiah Caldwell and Crimson Thunder on that foggy October night in night. The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove more disturbing than anyone had imagined, revealing a darkness that had lurked beneath the desert's surface for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal its terrible secrets. But that revelation was still 25 years away, and for now, the mystery of the vanished trucker remained just that, an unsolved puzzle that would haunt everyone who had known Jeremiah Caldwell and challenge the very notion that people simply don't disappear without a trace in modern America. The desert had claimed another victim, or so it seemed. But the desert was keeping more than just one secret beneath its endless expanse of sand and silence. The rhythmic pounding of hydraulic hammers echoed across the Mojave Desert as Caltrans construction crews worked to widen a problematic section of Interstate 4. 25 years had passed since Jeremiah Caldwell's disappearance, and the highway had seen millions of travelers cross the very spot where he had vanished. Most drove past mile marker 18-9 without a second thought, unaware they were traversing ground that held one of California's most enduring mysteries. 48-year-old construction foreman Diego Vasquez wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the massive excavation project. The state had finally allocated funds to expand this treacherous stretch of highway, after decades of accidents, blamed on inadequate shoulder space and poor sightlines. What should have been a routine road improvement project was about to become something far more significant. "Hey, Diego," called out Tommy Chen, a heavy equipment operator who had been working the morning shift on the massive Caterpillar excavator. "You need to see this, man. Something's not right down here." Diego climbed down into the excavation site, his steel-toed boots crunching on loose gravel. The crew had been digging for 3 days, removing tons of desert soil and rock to create the foundation for the expanded roadway. According to the geological surveys, they should have encountered nothing but natural sediment layers and the occasional piece of construction debris from the highway's original construction in the... "What have you got, Tommy?" Diego asked, noting the concern in the younger man's voice. Tommy pointed to a section of disturbed earth, about 20 feet from the highway's original edge. I hit something big about 6 feet down. Thought it might be an old culvert or storm drain. But look at this. Diego followed Tommy's gaze to where the excavator's bucket had scraped away layers of sand and gravel, revealing something that made his blood run cold. Protruding from the earth was a section of red metal, dulled by decades underground but still recognizable as automotive paint. More disturbing was the twisted chrome that caught the morning sunlight, reflecting it back in brief, ominous flashes. "Shut down the excavator," Diego ordered, his voice tight with tension. "Get everyone back from the dig site. This is now a potential crime scene." Word of the discovery spread quickly through the construction crew. Within an hour, the site was crawling with law enforcement officials. Sheriff's deputies secured the perimeter while crime scene technicians began the delicate process of fully exposing what lay buried beneath Interstate. Detective Lieutenant Monica Reyes of the Kern County Sheriff's Department arrived at 8:15 a.m., her 23 years of law enforcement experience immediately recognizing the significance of what had been unearthed. At 51, Reyes had seen her share of discoveries that rewrote case files, but this felt different from the moment she stepped onto the scene. The construction crew had inadvertently discovered what appeared to be a large vehicle buried approximately 6 feet beneath the desert surface, positioned parallel to the highway but hidden completely from view. The red paint and chrome trim suggested a truck, possibly a big rig. But the full extent of the discovery wouldn't be known until forensic archaeologists could properly excavate the site. "Have we contacted Amanda Torres?" Reyes asked her sergeant, referring to the now-retired detective who had originally investigated Jeremiah Caldwell's disappearance. "Already reached out," Sergeant Kevin Walsh replied. "She's driving up from Riverside. Should be here within the hour." The news reached Patricia Caldwell, now Patricia Morrison, at her job as a school secretary in Riverside. The phone call from Detective Reyes came 25 years, 10 months, and 28 days after her first husband had vanished into the desert fog. Patricia's hands trembled as she listened to the careful, professional explanation of what had been found. "We can't confirm anything yet, Mrs. Morrison," Reyes explained, "but given the location and the apparent size of the vehicle, we felt you should be notified immediately." Patricia had remarried in 2005 to Robert Morrison, a gentleman who had helped her rebuild her life while honoring Jeremiah's memory. Emma, now 37 and working as an investigative journalist for the Los Angeles Times, was covering a corruption trial in Sacramento when her mother called with the news. "Mom, slow down," Emma said, stepping out of the courthouse into the California sunshine. "What exactly did they find?" "A truck, Emma. They found a truck buried at mile marker 18-9. The same spot where your father..." Patricia's voice broke, 25 years of carefully maintained composure crumbling in an instant. Emma's world shifted on its axis. The disappearance of her father had driven her career choice, turning her into one of the state's most tenacious investigative reporters. She had spent years researching cold cases, missing persons files, and unsolved mysteries, always hoping to develop skills that might someday help solve her own family's greatest tragedy. "I'm driving down there now," Emma said, already walking toward her car. "Don't go to the site alone, Mum. Wait for me." At the excavation site, forensic anthropologist Dr. Catherine Hayes arrived with a team of specialists trained in recovering evidence from buried crime scenes. A professor at UC Davis with expertise in forensic archaeology, Dr. Hayes had worked dozens of cases where time and nature had concealed crucial evidence. "This is going to be a slow process," she explained to Detective Reyes. "We need to treat this like an archaeological dig. Every layer of soil could contain evidence, and we can't afford to destroy anything that might tell us what happened here." The excavation proceeded with painstaking care. Photographs documented every stage of the process as layers of desert sand and gravel were carefully removed. What emerged was both fascinating and horrifying. The buried vehicle was indeed a Peterbilt tractor-trailer, its distinctive profile unmistakable even after decades underground. The red paint, though faded and pitted by decades of mineral deposits, matched the description of Crimson Thunder from the 1998 missing persons report. But the condition of the truck told a story that investigators were not prepared for. The cab was severely damaged, crushed from above, as if by tremendous force. The trailer had been detached and positioned at an odd angle, suggesting the vehicle had been disassembled before burial. Most disturbing was the evidence that the burial had been deliberate and methodical. The excavation site showed clear signs of having been dug by heavy machinery, filled, and then carefully concealed. This wasn't an accident, Dr. Hayes observed as she photographed the positioning of the truck components. Someone buried this vehicle intentionally, and they had access to equipment capable of moving tons of earth. Amanda Torres arrived at the site just after noon, her 73-year-old frame moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to conserve energy for what mattered most. She had never stopped thinking about Jeremiah Caldwell's disappearance, even after her retirement. The case file had followed her home, along with the nagging certainty that she had missed something crucial in the original investigation. 25 years, she murmured as she stared at the emerging outline of Crimson Thunder. All this time he was right here. Detective Reyes briefed Torres on the discovery while the excavation continued around them. The construction project had been halted indefinitely, turning a routine highway improvement into what was shaping up to be one of the largest crime scene investigations in Kern County history. "Any sign of human remains?" Torres asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Not yet," Dr. Hayes replied from the excavation pit. "But we are still uncovering the cab area. That's where we would expect to find—" She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the implication. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the desert, the forensic team made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Hidden beneath the driver's seat of the crushed cab, protected by the truck's twisted metal frame, they found Jeremiah Caldwell's logbook. The leather-bound journal, standard equipment for long-haul truckers in 1998, had survived its underground burial remarkably well, protected from moisture by its location within the cab and preserved by the dry desert conditions. The logbook contained entries dating up to October 15, 1998, the night of Jeremiah's disappearance. Detective Reyes carefully bagged the logbook as evidence, but not before noting Jeremiah's final entry, written in his familiar handwriting just hours before he vanished. "Something's not right about this run. Dispatcher changed delivery instructions twice. Customer wants me to take Highway 58 detour instead of staying on I-40. Patricia always says trust your gut. Mine's screaming at me to turn around and go home." The entry was followed by a phone number and a name: Vincent Torino, emergency contact. Neither name nor number appeared in any of the original investigation files. Emma Morrison arrived at the construction site at 4:30 p.m., her press credentials getting her closer to the excavation than most civilians would have been allowed. The sight of her father's truck emerging from the desert earth hit her with unexpected force. For 25 years, she had imagined 100 different scenarios for what might have happened to Jeremiah Caldwell. Burial beneath the highway had never been among them. "Emma?" Detective Reyes approached the journalist with professional courtesy tinged with sympathy. "I'm sorry you have to see this. I needed to see it," Emma replied, her training as a reporter helping her maintain composure while her heart broke. "Has anyone run that name from the logbook?" "Vincent Torino." Reyes nodded. "Already in progress. No immediate hits in our databases, but we are expanding the search." As evening approached, the forensic team made their most significant discovery yet. Buried separately from the truck, approximately 50 feet away, they found the trailer's cargo doors, along with scattered computer components that matched the manifest from Jeremiah's final load. But there was something else, something that didn't belong with a routine electronics shipment. Wrapped in heavy plastic and hidden among the legitimate cargo were dozens of small packages, containing what appeared to be narcotics. Field tests confirmed the presence of heroin, with an estimated street value in the millions. Suddenly, Jeremiah Caldwell's disappearance took on an entirely different character. He was set up, Torres said, with the certainty of someone who had spent decades reading the stories told by evidence. Jeremiah didn't know he was carrying drugs. Someone used him as an unwitting mule, and when something went wrong, they eliminated the evidence. The discovery of narcotics transformed the investigation from a missing persons case to a homicide inquiry, with federal implications. The Drug Enforcement Administration was notified, along with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. What had begun as a construction project had unearthed evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the desert highways of California. But even as investigators began to piece together the criminal enterprise that had cost Jeremiah his life, questions remained. The burial site showed signs of professional planning and execution. Someone with significant resources and expertise had orchestrated both the murder and the cover-up. The precision of the concealment suggested involvement by individuals with law enforcement or military training. More disturbing was the realization that the burial had taken place within hours of Jeremiah's disappearance. Whoever was responsible had been prepared for this outcome, suggesting that Jeremiah's death was not a spontaneous decision, but part of a calculated plan. As darkness fell over the excavation site, powerful spotlights illuminated the continuing work. The desert that had kept its secrets for 25 years was finally being forced to reveal the truth. But each answer seemed to generate two new questions, and investigators began to realize they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple hijacking gone wrong. Emma Morrison stood at the edge of the crime scene tape, watching teams of specialists methodically document every piece of evidence. Her father's disappearance had shaped her entire adult life, driving her to seek truth in a world that often seemed determined to bury it. Now finally, she was getting answers, but they brought no peace. Jeremiah Caldwell had been murdered, his body buried along with his truck in a carefully planned operation designed to make him disappear forever. Someone had decided that a hard-working family man posed enough of a threat to warrant execution and elaborate concealment. The question that would drive the next phase of the investigation was simple but profound. Who had the motive, means, and opportunity to orchestrate such an elaborate crime? The answer, when it finally emerged, would expose a criminal network that had operated in the shadows for decades, using the nation's highways as corridors for trafficking drugs, weapons, and worse. Jeremiah Caldwell had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, carrying the wrong cargo for people who killed anyone who threatened their operations. But that was still to come. For now, the desert continued to yield its secrets, one carefully excavated layer at a time. As investigators worked through the night to reconstruct a 25-year-old crime that was about to shatter the carefully constructed facades of some very dangerous people. The war room at the Kern County Sheriff's Department buzzed with activity as investigators worked around the clock to unravel a 25-year-old conspiracy. Whiteboards covered with photographs, timelines, and connecting lines resembled the work of an obsessed detective from a crime thriller, but the stakes were devastatingly real. At the center of it all sat the evidence recovered from mile marker 189. Jeremiah Caldwell's logbook, fragments of his truck, and enough heroin to supply half of Southern California. Detective Lieutenant Monica Reyes hadn't slept more than 4 hours in the past 2 days. The Vincent Torino lead had opened doorways into a criminal underworld that seemed to stretch back decades. FBI Special Agent Catherine Wells, assigned to the Joint Task Force, spread a collection of files across the conference table like playing cards in a high-stakes game. Vincent Torino, Wells announced, pointing to a black-and-white surveillance photograph from 1997. Real name Vincent Anthony Torino, associate of the Benedetto crime family out of Las Vegas, specialized in transportation logistics for unconventional cargo. The photograph showed a lean man in his 40s with sharp features and cold eyes. Even in the grainy surveillance image, Torino projected an aura of calculated menace that made experienced law enforcement officers uncomfortable. He's been dead for 20 years, Wells continued. Found shot execution style in a Las Vegas parking garage in December 2003. But in 1998 he was running a sophisticated operation using long-haul truckers to move drugs across state lines. Amanda Torres, despite her retirement, had been granted special consultant status on the case. Her decades of experience with the original investigation made her irreplaceable. She studied Torino's photograph with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost. Jeremiah never mentioned this name during any of our interviews, Torres said. If he had dealings with Torino, he either didn't know who he was really working for, or he was scared enough to keep quiet, Reyes finished. The question is, how did a legitimate trucker with no criminal history end up carrying Torino's cargo? The answer came from an unexpected source. Emma Morrison had spent the previous night conducting her own investigation, using her journalist contacts and newspaper archives to research Westfield Logistics, Jeremiah's employer. What she discovered added another layer of complexity to an already Byzantine case. Westfield Logistics wasn't as clean as they appeared, Emma announced as she entered the conference room, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, and dark circles under her eyes betraying her sleepless night. I found bankruptcy filings from early. The company was hemorrhaging money, losing major contracts to competitors with lower rates. She opened her laptop and connected it to the room's presentation system. Financial documents filled the large monitor, painting a picture of a transportation company in its death throes. Look at this, Emma continued, highlighting specific entries. Starting in March 1998, Westfield suddenly started receiving payments from shell companies, Desert Wind Enterprises, Mojave Transport Solutions, Silver State Logistics, all of them traced back to Nevada Incorporation records that lead nowhere. Special Agent Wells leaned forward, recognizing the pattern. Front companies for money laundering. Torino was paying Westfield to use their legitimate drivers as unknowing drug mules. The company was probably desperate enough to ask no questions about the extra income. The revelation cast Jeremiah's death in an even more tragic light. He had been an innocent man caught in a web of criminal enterprise and corporate desperation, used by people who viewed human life as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of profit. Dr. Catherine Hayes entered the conference room carrying a file folder thick with forensic reports. The forensic anthropologist had been working non-stop to extract every possible piece of evidence from the burial site. "We have recovered additional human remains," she announced, her professional demeanor unable to mask the gravity of her discovery. Male, consistent with Jeremiah Caldwell's age and physical description. But there's something else. She opened the folder and displayed crime scene photographs that sent a chill through the room. The images showed evidence of systematic violence, fractured ribs, a shattered skull, multiple trauma consistent with severe beating. Jeremiah didn't die quickly, Dr. Hayes continued. These injuries suggest prolonged torture, possibly interrogation. Someone wanted information from him before they killed him. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Jeremiah Caldwell had not simply been eliminated to protect a drug operation. He had been brutally tortured, suggesting his killers believed he knew something worth extracting through violence. What could he have known? Torres asked. If he was an unwitting mule, what information would be worth torturing him for? The answer came from Emma's laptop. She had been cross-referencing her father's delivery records with the dates of Torino's known operations. A pattern emerged that turned the investigation in an entirely new direction. Dad made 6 runs for Westfield in the 3 months before he disappeared, Emma said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of discussing her father's final weeks. Each time, the cargo manifests showed legitimate freight, but the delivery location. She paused, double-checking her research. Every single delivery was to addresses that no longer exist, warehouses that were demolished, businesses that went bankrupt immediately after receiving shipments. Special Agent Wells felt the familiar thrill of a breakthrough. He was building a case. Your father figured out what was happening, and started documenting it. The theory gained credibility as investigators examined Jeremiah's final weeks through this new lens. His widow, Patricia, now Patricia Morrison, was contacted and asked to search for any personal effects that might have survived from what she found in a forgotten storage box in her garage sent shockwaves through the investigation. Hidden beneath old tax returns and insurance documents was a manila envelope containing photographs, receipts, and handwritten notes in Jeremiah's careful script. The photographs showed him at various delivery locations, documenting the suspicious circumstances of his runs. The notes revealed a man growing increasingly suspicious of his employer's new clients. October 3rd, delivered to Riverside Warehouse. Building supposed to be active electronics depot. Saw maybe 2 workers, no inventory visible. Weird for a major distribution center. October 8th, Phoenix Run. GPS coordinates led to empty lot. Had to call dispatcher 3 times to get corrected address. Final delivery point was abandoned gas station on outskirts of town. October 12th, LA delivery to Advanced Computer Solutions. No signs on building, no company vehicles in parking lot. Asked dispatcher about strange delivery patterns. Was told to focus on driving, not asking questions. The final entry was dated October 14th, just 1 day before Jeremiah's disappearance. Called FBI field office in Bakersfield. Spoke to Agent Mitchell Thompson about suspicious deliveries. Meeting scheduled for October 16th. Told Patricia I might have stumbled onto something big. God help me if I'm right. The revelation that Jeremiah had contacted the FBI transformed the entire investigation. Agent Mitchell Thompson, now retired and living in Oregon, was contacted immediately. His phone interview provided the missing piece of the puzzle that investigators had been seeking for 25 years. I remember that call, Thompson said, his voice heavy with regret. Caldwell was scared but determined. Said he thought his employer was being used to transport illegal cargo. We scheduled a meeting for the 16th, but he never showed. When I tried to follow up, I was told he had left town unexpectedly. The lies surrounding Jeremiah's disappearance ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Someone had been monitoring his communications, possibly even intercepting his phone calls. His murder hadn't been a spontaneous decision by drug traffickers, eliminating a threat. It had been a carefully planned execution designed to prevent him from meeting with federal agents. Detective Reyes felt the weight of revelation settling over the room. They knew he was going to talk. Someone with access to law enforcement communications or phone records tipped them off. The investigation now faced a disturbing possibility: corruption within law enforcement agencies that had enabled Jeremiah's murder and subsequent cover-up. The precision of the burial, the complete absence of evidence for 25 years, and the systematic misdirection of the original investigation all pointed to inside assistance. Emma Morrison sat quietly as investigators discussed the implications of their discoveries. Her father hadn't simply been a victim of random violence. He had been a hero who died trying to expose a criminal conspiracy. The knowledge brought both pride and renewed grief, along with a burning determination to see his killers brought to justice. "There's something else," Dr. Hayes announced, consulting her forensic reports. The burial site shows evidence of multiple vehicles and at least 4 to 6 individuals involved in the concealment. This wasn't a small operation. It required significant coordination and resources. Special Agent Wells was already working her contacts within the FBI's Organized Crime Division. The Benedetto family connection provided a starting point for identifying other members of Torino's network who might still be alive. Computer databases that didn't exist in 1998 now offered powerful tools for connecting seemingly unrelated crimes across multiple jurisdictions. "We are looking at a minimum of 6 individuals directly involved in Caldwell's murder," Wells said. "Torino's dead, but his associates might still be out there. Some of them could still be alive and active." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Chen, the construction worker who had first discovered the buried truck, approached investigators with information he had initially dismissed as irrelevant. "My grandfather used to work highway construction back in the day," Tommy explained. "Crews working the night shift in October. He mentioned seeing unusual activity around mile marker 18-9. Heavy equipment operating in the early morning hours when no scheduled work was supposed to be happening." Tommy's grandfather, now 87 and living in a Bakersfield nursing home, agreed to be interviewed. His memories from that night provided crucial details that investigators had never uncovered. "Big excavator, couple of dump trucks," the elderly man recalled. "Thought it was emergency road repair at first, but they weren't wearing Caltrans uniforms. Had that professional look, you know, like military or law enforcement. Figured it wasn't my business to ask questions." The description matched equipment rental records that Special Agent Wells had been investigating. In October 1998, a company called Desert Construction Solutions had rented heavy machinery for what they described as emergency infrastructure repair. The company had paid in cash, provided false contact information, and vanished immediately after returning the equipment. But rental companies keep more detailed records than criminals sometimes realize. The equipment had been signed out by a man using the name David Torino, likely Vincent's brother or cousin. Someone trusted enough to handle the logistical aspects of the burial operation. As afternoon turned to evening, investigators realized they were dealing with a criminal conspiracy far larger than a simple drug trafficking operation. The level of planning, the access to heavy equipment, the ability to monitor law enforcement communications, and the precision of the cover-up all suggested involvement by individuals with professional training and significant resources. The murder of Jeremiah Caldwell was beginning to look like the work of a criminal organization, with tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses, law enforcement agencies, and possibly even political circles. His death hadn't been the random elimination of a threat. It had been the methodical removal of a witness who posed an existential danger to a carefully constructed criminal empire. But empires, even criminal ones, eventually fall. The desert had finally given up its secrets, and investigators now had the tools and determination necessary to follow the evidence wherever it led. Jeremiah Caldwell's voice, silenced for 25 years, was finally being heard. The question that would drive the next phase of the investigation was whether anyone from the original conspiracy was still alive and whether they could be brought to justice for crimes committed in a different era. The answer would prove more shocking than anyone anticipated, revealing connections between past and present that would shake the foundations of law enforcement in Southern California. Emma Morrison packed her laptop as the meeting concluded, knowing that her father's story was far from over. The truth was emerging, piece by piece, but the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. Somewhere in the shadows, people who had thought themselves safe from their past crimes were about to discover that justice, like the desert, has a very long memory. September 8, FBI Field Office, Los Angeles, 9:23 a.m., temperature 82 PFTU, smoggy high-pressure system. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the FBI's Los Angeles field office cast harsh shadows across the faces of investigators who had been working the Caldwell case for 4 straight days. Special Agent Catherine Wells spread crime scene photographs across the conference table like tarot cards, revealing an ominous future. Each image told part of a story that grew more disturbing with every piece of evidence they uncovered. "David Torino," Wells announced, pointing to a driver's license photograph from 1998. "Vincent's younger brother. Still alive, still active, and according to our surveillance, still very much in the business of making problems disappear." The photograph showed a man in his early 40s with the same sharp features as his deceased brother. But where Vincent had projected cold calculation, David's eyes held something more dangerous, the unpredictable malice of someone who enjoyed the violent aspects of his work. Detective Lieutenant Monica Reyes studied the intelligence reports that had been compiled over the previous 72 hours. David Torino had managed to avoid serious prison time for 25 years through a combination of careful planning, intimidation of witnesses, and what appeared to be strategic corruption of law enforcement officials. He's been operating under the radar. Wells continued. Officially, he runs a legitimate equipment rental business in Havana. Unofficially, he's suspected of involvement in at least 12 unsolved murders across 3 states. The problem is that witnesses have a tendency to disappear or suddenly develop amnesia when it comes time to testify. Emma Morrison sat at the far end of the conference table, her journalist notebook filled with details that would eventually become the story of her father's murder. But what had started as a quest for personal closure was evolving into something far more dangerous. Her investigation had attracted attention from people who preferred their secrets to remain buried in the desert. "Someone's been asking questions about me," Emma said, her voice carefully controlled despite the fear that had been growing since the previous evening. "My editor received a call yesterday from someone claiming to be conducting a background check for a potential employer. Same story to my landlord, my bank, even my gym." Special Agent Wells felt the familiar chill that came with realizing an investigation had moved from historical crime solving to active threat assessment. "Have you noticed anyone following you? Unusual activity around your apartment or office?" Emma nodded reluctantly. "A van parked across from my apartment building for 3 nights running. Different vehicles, but always someone sitting inside, always watching. And yesterday, someone broke into my car in the Times parking garage. Nothing was taken, but my glove compartment and console had been searched." The revelation that Emma had become a target transformed the dynamic of the investigation. 25 years after Jeremiah Caldwell's murder, the same criminal network was still active, still willing to eliminate threats to their operations. The desert burial that was supposed to end with Jeremiah's silence had only delayed the reckoning. Amanda Torres, despite her 73 years, felt the old instincts of an experienced detective awakening. "They are scared," she observed. "After 25 years of thinking they were safe, suddenly we are pulling their operation apart piece by piece. Someone's panicking." The panic was justified. FBI financial crimes investigators had been working around the clock to trace the money trail from 1998. Using modern computer databases and analysis techniques that hadn't existed during the original investigation. What they discovered was a criminal empire built on the systematic corruption of legitimate businesses and law enforcement officials. Desert Wind Enterprises, the shell company that was paying Westfield Logistics, was just one part of a larger network, Special Agent Wells explained, pointing to a complex flowchart that covered an entire whiteboard. "We have identified at least 23 different front companies, all ultimately controlled by a single organization that's been operating for over 30 years. The organization had tentacles reaching into transportation companies, construction firms, equipment rental businesses, and most disturbing of all, law enforcement agencies across the Southwest. The pattern was always the same: identify financially vulnerable legitimate businesses, offer them lucrative contracts that they couldn't afford to refuse, and gradually transform them into unwitting accomplices in criminal operations. The genius of it," Wells continued, "is that most of the business owners never knew they were participating in criminal activities. They thought they were just making legitimate deliveries or providing equipment rentals. The real criminal activity was hidden in layers of shell companies and false documentation. But maintaining such an extensive criminal network required constant vigilance and occasional violence. Investigators had identified 47 suspicious deaths over the past 25 years. Truck drivers, warehouse workers, business owners, and even law enforcement officers who had apparently gotten too close to uncovering the truth. Dr. Catherine Hayes entered the conference room carrying a folder that contained the results of her final forensic analysis. The forensic anthropologist's expression suggested that her discoveries would add new dimensions to an already complex case. "I found something in the soil samples from the burial site," she announced, opening the folder to reveal microscopic photographs. "Traces of a specific type of concrete, high-grade industrial material used in specialized construction projects. This wasn't random desert dirt used to cover the grave. The concrete traces were traced to a specific manufacturer in Nevada, a company that had supplied materials for several high-security facilities including private prisons, military installations, and government buildings. The discovery suggested that Jeremiah's killers had access to specialized materials and possibly connections to secure facilities. Someone with institutional knowledge planned this burial, Dr. Hayes continued. The depth, the positioning, the type of fill material, it was designed by people who understood how to hide evidence from forensic investigation. Emma Morrison felt a chill as the implications became clear. Her father's killers weren't just criminal thugs. They were professionals with training and resources that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. The same people who were now watching her apartment and searching her car. The next revelation came from an unexpected source. Tommy Chen, the construction worker who had discovered the buried truck, contacted investigators with information that had taken him days to process. His grandfather, the elderly highway worker who had witnessed the burial operation, had remembered additional details during a second interview. Gramps said he recognized one of the men directing the burial. Tommy explained. Not by name, but by face. Said he looked familiar, like someone he had seen in official capacity, maybe a cop or sheriff's deputy. The possibility that law enforcement officials had been directly involved in Jeremiah's murder sent shockwaves through the investigation team. It explained how the killers had been able to monitor FBI communications, how they had known about Jeremiah's planned meeting with Agent Thompson, and how they had managed to keep the crime hidden for 25 years. Special Agent Wells immediately initiated an internal investigation into law enforcement personnel who had been active in the area in 1998. The results were disturbing. 3 sheriff's deputies from that era had retired unusually early, with substantial financial assets that couldn't be explained by their official salaries. 2 others had died in suspicious circumstances, one in a single-car accident, another from an apparent heart attack at age 42. We are dealing with a criminal organization that has been systematically infiltrating and corrupting law enforcement for decades, Wells announced during an emergency briefing with FBI leadership. The Caldwell murder wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of eliminating threats to a massive criminal enterprise. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Emma Morrison's investigation into her father's final weeks had led her to examine the personnel records of Westfield Logistics. What she found would forever change her understanding of her father's death. Richard Westfield, the owner of the trucking company, hadn't been a desperate businessman, reluctantly accepting dirty money. He had been a full partner in the criminal operation from the beginning. Financial records showed that Westfield had been receiving payments from Torino-controlled companies since 1995, 3 years before Jeremiah's murder. More disturbing was the discovery that Westfield had specifically requested Jeremiah for the runs involving illegal cargo. The choice hadn't been random. Jeremiah had been targeted because of his reputation for reliability and his lack of connections to the criminal underworld. He was the perfect unwitting mule, someone whose disappearance would be attributed to highway dangers rather than criminal conspiracy. He was hunting my father, Emma said, her voice barely controlled as she processed the betrayal. Westfield knew Dad was asking questions, knew he was getting suspicious. The final run wasn't an attempt to eliminate a threat. It was a trap designed to lure him to an isolated location where he could be safely murdered. The revelation that Jeremiah had been deliberately targeted added a personal dimension to the investigation that pushed it beyond routine law enforcement work into the realm of vendetta. Emma Morrison was no longer just a journalist covering a story. She was a woman seeking justice for a father who had been betrayed by someone he trusted. Richard Westfield was still alive, living in comfortable retirement in Arizona, on wealth that investigators now knew had been built on the systematic exploitation and murder of his own employees. But approaching him would require careful planning. 25 years of successful criminal operation had taught him to be cautious about law enforcement attention. The decision was made to place Westfield under surveillance while investigators continued building their case. But the criminal network had been watching them just as carefully. The same people who had monitored Jeremiah's communications in 1998 were now tracking the current investigation. Emma Morrison discovered just how closely she was being watched when she returned to her Los Angeles apartment on the evening of September 18th. The door was still locked, the security system still armed, but someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, but her laptop had been moved, her files had been searched, and a message had been left on her bathroom mirror, written in what appeared to be lipstick. Some stories are too dangerous to tell. The message was both a warning and a threat, delivered by people who had been eliminating inconvenient witnesses for over 2 decades. Emma immediately contacted the FBI, but she also realized that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her investigation into her father's murder had made her a target of the same people who had killed him. Special Agent Wells arranged for protective surveillance, but both she and Emma knew that the criminal network had resources and connections that made traditional law enforcement protection problematic. Someone within the system was still feeding information to David Torino and his associates. The investigation was approaching a critical juncture. Investigators had identified the criminal network, uncovered evidence of systematic corruption, and traced the money trail back to its sources. But they were also dealing with a ruthless organization that had been eliminating threats for 25 years and showed no signs of hesitation about continuing that path. "We need to move fast," Wells announced during an emergency strategy session. "Too many people know we are closing in. If we don't make arrests soon, we are going to start losing witnesses and evidence." But the criminal network was also moving fast. Within hours of Emma's apartment being searched, Tommy Chen reported that his grandfather had been approached by men claiming to be conducting a routine follow-up interview about his construction work. The elderly man had become suspicious and refused to speak with them. But the message was clear. Anyone connected to the investigation was now at risk. The hunter had become the hunted. 25 years after Jeremiah Caldwell's murder, the same criminal organization was still active, still dangerous, and still willing to kill to protect their secrets. The question that would determine the outcome of the investigation was whether modern law enforcement techniques and determination could overcome a quarter-century of criminal experience and institutional corruption. Emma Morrison packed a bag and checked into a downtown hotel under an assumed name, knowing that her life had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just seeking answers about her father's death. She was fighting for her own survival against people who had perfected the art of making problems disappear. The desert had given up Jeremiah Caldwell's secrets, but it might soon be called upon to keep new ones. The investigation that had started with the discovery of a buried truck was evolving into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with stakes that extended far beyond solving a 25-year-old murder case. Somewhere in the shadows, David Torino and his associates were planning their next move, drawing on decades of experience in eliminating threats to their criminal empire. The question was whether investigators could expose the truth before becoming victims of the same violence that had claimed Jeremiah Caldwell's life so many years ago in the foggy darkness of the Mojave Desert. September, downtown Los Angeles hotel, 3:47 a.m., temperature 67 with clear Santa Ana wind. Emma Morrison jolted awake to the sound of her hotel room door clicking open. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she lay frozen in the darkness, her mind processing the impossible reality that someone had bypassed the electronic lock and entered her room. The red numerals of the bedside clock cast an eerie glow across the ceiling as she heard the soft footsteps of at least 2 people moving through her suite. Her hand moved slowly toward the cell phone on the nightstand, but a voice from the darkness stopped her cold. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Miss Morris." The voice belonged to a man with a slight accent, possibly Southern, maybe Nevada, and carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Emma's blood turned to ice as she realized that 25 years after her father's murder, she was about to meet the same fate. "We are not here to hurt you," the voice continued, though the statement carried no comfort. "We are here to have a conversation. One that your father should have had before he made some very poor decisions." A lamp clicked on, revealing two men in expensive suits that looked out of place in the pre-dawn hours. The older man, possibly in his 60s, had silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The younger man stood by the door, his hand resting inside his jacket in a position that suggested immediate access to a weapon. "David Torino," Emma said, recognizing the older man from FBI surveillance photographs. Up close, Vincent's brother projected an aura of sophisticated menace that was somehow more terrifying than overt violence. "Very good," Torino replied, settling into the room's single chair with casual ease. "Your father was equally perceptive. Unfortunately, he lacked the wisdom to understand when curiosity becomes dangerous." Emma forced herself to sit up, drawing the hotel bathrobe around her shoulders like armor against the chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Her journalist training kicked in, even in the face of mortal danger. If she was going to die, she wanted answers first. "He was trying to expose you," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. Torino smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Your father was trying to play hero. 25 years ago, the world was different. Technology was simpler. Law enforcement was more cooperative. People understood their place in the natural order of things. The natural order that included murdering truck drivers. The natural order that understood the difference between those who build systems and those who service them." Torino replied, "Your father was a service provider. His job was to drive trucks from point A to point B and collect his paycheck. Instead, he decided to become an investigator." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of sirens growing louder. Torino's companion moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the street below. His expression suggested that whatever he saw wasn't part of their plan. "Sir," the younger man said, his voice tight with concern, "we have got a problem. 8 floors below, FBI Special Agent Catherine Wells coordinated a multi-agency task force that had been mobilized after Emma's protective detail lost contact with her 3 hours earlier. The discovery that someone had accessed Emma's hotel room using sophisticated electronic equipment had triggered a full-scale emergency response. Buildings surrounded, Wells announced through her radio headset. All exits covered. Nobody goes in or out without authorization. Detective Lieutenant Monica Reyes stood beside an armored command vehicle, studying blueprints of the hotel while SWAT teams positioned themselves at strategic points. The past 72 hours had been a coordinated race between law enforcement trying to build their case and criminals trying to eliminate witnesses. The race was about to reach its conclusion. "Do we know how many subjects are in the room?" asked Captain James Rodriguez, the SWAT team commander. "At least 2, possibly 3, Wells replied, "and we have to assume they are armed and extremely dangerous. These are people who have been killing to protect their secrets for 25 years. Back in the hotel room, Torino's calm demeanor never wavered despite the obvious complication of law enforcement presence. He had been in dangerous situations before, and understood that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. "It appears our conversation is going to be shorter than anticipated," he said to Emma, "but perhaps that's appropriate. Your father's final conversation was also brief." Emma felt a surge of rage that overwhelmed her fear. "Tell me what happened to him." Torino checked his watch, seemingly oblivious to the sirens and activity outside. "October 15th, 1998. Your father met us at mile marker 18-9 as scheduled. We had arranged for him to pull over, supposedly for a routine inspection of his cargo. He was suspicious but cooperative. You tortured him." "We asked him questions," Torino corrected, "about what he had discovered, who he had talked to, what evidence he might have collected. Your father was remarkably stubborn. Even when it became clear that cooperation would reduce his suffering, he refused to provide information that might have compromised other people. The revelation that Jeremiah had endured torture to protect others added another layer of heroism to his memory. But it also filled Emma with a grief so profound that it threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly. "He died protecting people he didn't even know," she whispered. "He died because he couldn't understand that some systems are bigger than individual conscience." Torino replied, "Our organization has moved billions of dollars in merchandise across the country over the past 30 years. We have provided employment for thousands of people, generated tax revenue for dozens of communities, and maintained a level of order that benefits everyone involved. You have murdered innocent people. We have eliminated threats to a system that works," Torino corrected. "Your father threatened not just our operation, but the livelihoods of countless people who depend on us. Sometimes individual sacrifice is necessary for the greater good." The sound of heavy boots in the hotel corridor suggested that their conversation was about to be interrupted. Torino's companion drew his weapon, a sleek automatic pistol that looked military in origin. The older man simply smiled and straightened his tie. "Miss Morrison," Torino said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "You have two choices. You can end your investigation here and return to your comfortable life as a journalist, or you can continue pursuing answers that will only lead to more death and suffering. You are threatening me. I'm offering you the same choice we offered your father. The only difference is that you have the benefit of seeing what happened to him when he made the wrong decision." The hotel room door exploded inward as SWAT officers breached the entrance with controlled charges. Emma instinctively dove behind the bed as automatic weapons fire erupted in the small space. The sound was deafening, overwhelming her senses, as bullets shattered furniture and punched through walls. When the gunfire finally stopped, Emma emerged to find Torino's companion dead on the floor, his weapon unfired and his body riddled with bullets. But David Torino himself was gone, vanished as completely as if he had never been there at all. "Windows open," one of the SWAT officers reported. "Looks like he went out onto the fire escape." Special Agent Wells entered the room, weapon drawn, her eyes immediately focusing on Emma. "Are you hurt?" "No," Emma replied, though she wasn't entirely certain. The adrenaline made it difficult to assess her physical condition. "He's gone." Torino escaped. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in Los Angeles history. Helicopters swept the downtown area while police units cordoned off entire city blocks. But David Torino had spent decades evading law enforcement, and he seemed to vanish into the urban landscape with the same efficiency that his organization had used to hide bodies in the desert. By dawn, it became clear that the immediate threat had passed, but the larger danger remained. Torino's organization still existed, still functioned, and still posed a threat to anyone who challenged their operations. The hotel confrontation had been a tactical victory for law enforcement, but a strategic stalemate in the larger war. Emma Morrison found herself in protective custody at an FBI safe house in the San Fernando Valley, surrounded by agents and wondering how her life had transformed from investigating her father's disappearance to running for her life from the same people who had killed him. "We are going to get him," Special Agent Wells assured her during a debriefing session. "Torino made a mistake by coming after you personally. He exposed himself, and now we know he's still in the area." But Emma had learned enough about Torino's organization to understand that capture wouldn't necessarily end the threat. The criminal network had survived for 30 years by building in redundancy and succession planning. Eliminating David Torino might temporarily disrupt their operations, but it wouldn't destroy the system that had claimed her father's life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Richard Westfield, the former owner of Westfield Logistics, had been watching news coverage of the investigation from his retirement home in Scottsdale, Arizona. The hotel shootout and Emma's narrow escape had apparently triggered a crisis of conscience that had been building for 25 years. "I want to make a deal," Westfield told FBI agents who arrested him at his golf club. "I will tell you everything I know about Torino's operation, but I want protection and immunity from prosecution." The offer was tempting but problematic. Westfield had been complicit in multiple murders and had profited from criminal activities for decades. Granting him immunity would mean that one of the key architects of Jeremiah Caldwell's death would escape justice. Emma Morrison's opinion was sought during the negotiations, and her response surprised everyone involved. "Give him the deal," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional cost of the decision. "Dad died trying to expose this organization. If letting Westfield go free means we can bring down the entire network, then that's what Dad would have wanted." Westfield's cooperation opened floodgates of information that had been sealed for decades. He provided details about the criminal network structure, identified corrupt law enforcement officials, and revealed the locations of evidence that had been hidden since the night. The organization was bigger than anyone imagined. Westfield explained during hours of recorded testimony. "We weren't just moving drugs. We were trafficking weapons, laundering money for multiple crime families, and even handling contracts for political assassinations." Jeremiah stumbled onto something that could have brought down half the criminal underworld in the southwestern United States. The revelations explained why Jeremiah's death had been planned with such precision, and why the cover-up had been so thorough. He hadn't just threatened a drug operation, he had posed an existential threat to a criminal empire worth billions of dollars. But Westfield's most shocking revelation concerned the extent of law enforcement corruption. 3 FBI agents, 7 sheriff's deputies, 2 federal judges, and multiple state officials had been on Torino's payroll for years. The criminal network hadn't just been avoiding law enforcement, they had been controlling significant portions of it. "That's how they knew about Jeremiah's meeting with Agent Thompson," Westfield explained. "We had people inside the FBI feeding us information about any investigation that might threaten our operations." The scope of corruption made it clear why the original investigation had failed so completely. Key evidence had been suppressed, witness statements had been altered, and the entire case had been deliberately misdirected by people sworn to uphold the law. Emma Morrison listened to Westfield's testimony with a mixture of satisfaction and horror. Finally, after 25 years, she was getting the answers she had sought her entire adult life. But the answers revealed a level of systematic corruption that challenged her faith in justice itself. "My father died believing that the system would work," she told Special Agent Wells after Westfield's final interview. "He thought that if he just collected enough evidence and presented it to the right people, justice would prevail. Instead, the people he trusted were the ones who sold him out." Wells understood Emma's disillusionment, but also recognized the opportunity that Westfield's cooperation had created. For the first time in 30 years, law enforcement had a complete picture of Torino's criminal network and the evidence necessary to bring it down. "We are going to get them all," Wells promised. "Every corrupt official, every criminal associate, every person who profited from your father's death. The system failed Jeremiah Caldwell in 1998, but it's not going to fail him now." The investigation entered its final phase with coordinated raids across 3 states. FBI agents, working with the few law enforcement officials they could trust, moved simultaneously against dozens of targets connected to Reno's organization. The operation was named Desert Thunder in honor of Jeremiah Caldwell's truck, and it represented the largest organized crime takedown in southwestern history. But David Torino himself remained at large, somewhere in the vast expanse of desert and cities where he had operated for decades. The man who had personally tortured and murdered Jeremiah Caldwell was still free, still dangerous, and still capable of eliminating anyone who threatened him. The final confrontation was still to come, and Emma Morrison knew that it would determine whether her father's death would finally be avenged, or whether the criminal empire he had died trying to expose would survive to claim new victims. The desert that had hidden Jeremiah's body for 25 years was about to witness the culmination of a quarter-century quest for justice. Somewhere in the shadows, David Torino was planning his next move, drawing on decades of experience in eliminating threats to his criminal empire. The question was whether the truth that had finally emerged from the desert would be powerful enough to overcome the violence and corruption that had protected his secrets for so long. October, mile marker, 4:31 a.m., temperature 54°. Clear skies, light fog. Exactly 25 years to the minute after Jeremiah Caldwell's final radio transmission, Emma Morrison stood at mile marker 18:09 watching the sun rise over the Mojave Desert. The landscape looked deceptively peaceful in the early morning light, giving no hint of the violence that had occurred here, or the massive investigation that had finally brought truth to light. In the 3 weeks since Operation Desert Thunder had dismantled David Torino's criminal empire, 43 arrests had been made across 3 states. Corrupt law enforcement officials, money launderers, drug traffickers, and the legitimate business owners who had been co-opted into the network all faced federal charges. The scope of the takedown had made national news, but the story that mattered most to Emma was more personal. Special Agent Catherine Wells approached from the FBI Mobile Command Unit that had been set up near the original excavation site. The past month had aged the veteran agent considerably, the weight of uncovering decades of systematic corruption taking its toll on someone who had dedicated her career to believing in the integrity of law enforcement. Forensic accounting teams finished going through Torino's financial records. Wells reported, "We have identified at least 67 victims over the past 30 years. Your father was one of the first, but unfortunately not the last." Emma nodded, unsurprised by the revelation. The criminal network that had claimed Jeremiah's life had continued operating for another quarter-century, claiming new victims whenever someone got too close to uncovering their secrets. The desert had kept more secrets than anyone had imagined. "Any word on David Torino?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer from Wells's expression. "Nothing concrete. He's gone underground completely. Could be anywhere from Mexico to Canada by now. But we have frozen all his known assets, dismantled his organization, and put every law enforcement agency in North America on alert. He's running out of places to hide." Emma wasn't entirely convinced that David Torino could be captured through conventional law enforcement methods. A man who had evaded justice for 30 years while building a criminal empire across multiple states possessed resources and connections that extended far beyond what investigators had uncovered. But she also understood that his organization's destruction had left him isolated and vulnerable in ways he had never experienced before. The memorial service for Jeremiah Caldwell had been held the previous week at a small church in Riverside, attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his story. Truck drivers from across the country had parked their rigs in the church parking lot, creating a sea of chrome and steel that stretched for blocks. The CB radio chatter had been constant as drivers shared memories of Jeremiah and stories of others who had vanished on America's highways. Patricia Morrison, now 68, had delivered a eulogy that captured both the grief of losing her first husband and the satisfaction of finally knowing the truth about his disappearance. Standing at the podium in front of Jeremiah's photograph, she had spoken with a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. "Jeremiah died trying to do the right thing," she had said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "He could have ignored what he was seeing, could have just driven his routes and collected his paychecks. Instead, he chose to stand up against people who thought they were above the law. His death wasn't meaningless. It was the beginning of a fight for justice that took 25 years to win." Emma's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Detective Lieutenant Monica Reyes. The investigation was officially closed, but Reyes continued monitoring intelligence reports for any sign of David Torino's whereabouts. "Emma, we may have a lead on Torino," Reyes said without preamble. "Border Patrol picked up chatter about a high-value target trying to arrange passage into Mexico through Tijuana. Description matches, and the timing fits with his disappearance from Los Angeles." The news didn't surprise Emma. Torino's organization had operated throughout Mexico and Central America, and he likely maintained safe houses and contact networks south of the border. If he could reach Mexico, He might disappear permanently into a world where American law enforcement had limited reach. Are they moving to intercept? Emma asked. Customs and Border Protection is coordinating with DEA and the Mexican authorities, Reyes replied. But you know how these things go. By the time all the agencies get their act together, he could be long gone. Loma ended the call and continued her vigil at mile marker 89. She had come here on the anniversary of her father's death to find some sense of closure, but the possibility that his killer might escape justice left her feeling hollow. 25 years of questions had been answered, but the man ultimately responsible for Jeremiah's torture and murder remained free. The sound of approaching vehicles drew her attention. A convoy of black SUVs was moving along the highway at high speed, their government license plates and tinted windows suggesting federal law enforcement. The vehicles pulled off at the mile marker, and Emma recognized Special Agent Wells emerging from the lead vehicle along with several agents she didn't recognize. "We got him," Wells announced, her voice carrying a satisfaction that had been absent for weeks. "David Torino is in federal custody." The capture had occurred not at the Mexican border, but in a location that carried profound symbolic significance. Torino had been arrested at a truck stop outside Bakersfield, the same facility where Jeremiah Caldwell had made his final radio transmission 25 years earlier. Whether his presence there had been coincidental or some twisted form of nostalgia would never be known, but the irony was undeniable. "He didn't resist," Wells continued, "just sat in his rental car until our agents surrounded him, almost like he was waiting for us." Emma felt a complex mixture of emotions as she processed the news. Relief that Torino would finally face justice, satisfaction that her father's killer had been captured, but also a strange sense of anticlimax. After 25 years of mystery and 3 weeks of intense investigation, the final confrontation had ended not with violence but with quiet surrender. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Federal charges for conspiracy, murder, racketeering, drug trafficking, and about 20 other counts," Wells replied. "He's looking at life without parole, assuming he lives long enough to go to trial. A lot of people have reasons to want David Torino dead, and federal prison isn't always the safest place for someone with his history." The investigation had revealed that Torino's organization had been involved in eliminating rivals and witnesses for multiple crime families across the Southwest. His arrest had likely triggered a reassessment by other criminal organizations about whether he posed a threat to their operations while in federal custody. Emma drove back to Los Angeles that afternoon, with a sense that one chapter of her life was ending, while another was beginning. The mystery that had defined her entire adult life had been solved, but the knowledge brought responsibility along with closure. She had become the custodian of her father's story and the unofficial spokesperson for dozens of other victims whose deaths had been uncovered during the investigation. The highway seemed different now, transformed from a ribbon of mystery into a memorial corridor where she could finally see her father's journey with clarity. Every mile marker held new meaning. Every truck stop represented a place where other drivers might be facing the same impossible choices that had ultimately cost Jeremiah his life. Her phone had been ringing constantly since news of Torino's arrest broke. Television producers wanted exclusive interviews, book publishers were making increasingly aggressive offers, and fellow journalists sought quotes about the intersection of organized crime and highway transportation. Emma had ignored most of the calls, but one message stood out from the cacophony. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults had left a detailed voicemail about establishing a database of missing truck drivers and transportation workers. "Your father's case has opened our eyes to a pattern we never recognized," Dr. Walsh had explained. "We believe there may be hundreds of similar cases across the country. Drivers who vanished under suspicious circumstances but were written off as routine highway disappearances." The Los Angeles Times had offered her a book deal and a promotion to senior investigative reporter, recognizing that her personal connection to the story had driven one of the most significant organized crime investigations in California history. But Emma wasn't sure she wanted to profit from her father's death, even if the publicity might help other families find answers to their own missing persons cases. That evening she met with Amanda Torres at a small restaurant in Riverside, the same diner where her mother had worked double shifts while Jeremiah was on the road. Torres, now 74, had been following the investigation with the intensity of someone who had never truly retired from law enforcement. 47 families, Torres said, stirring sugar into her coffee with trembling hands. That's how many people we have identified as potential victims of Torino's organization over the past 30 years. 47 families who thought their loved ones had simply vanished into America's highways. Emma listened as Torres detailed the scope of what investigators had uncovered. Truck drivers weren't the only victims. Warehouse workers who had discovered discrepancies in cargo manifests, mechanics who had noticed suspicious modifications to vehicles, even dispatchers who had asked too many questions about unusual shipping routes. The criminal network had eliminated anyone who posed a threat, regardless of how peripheral their knowledge might have been. The pattern was always the same, Torres continued. Someone would notice something unusual, start asking questions, and then disappear. Local law enforcement would investigate, find no immediate evidence of foul play, and eventually classify the cases as voluntary disappearances or accidents. Meanwhile, the bodies were buried in remote locations where they had never been found, until construction projects started expanding into those remote locations. Emma, Torres nodded grimly. We are working with state transportation departments across the Southwest to identify areas where highway expansion or development projects might uncover additional burial sites. The ground-penetrating radar surveys alone are going to cost millions of dollars. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dolores Ramirez, the truck driver who had been the last person to speak with Jeremiah on the CB radio 25 years earlier. Now 76 and walking with a cane, Dolores had driven down from Bakersfield specifically to meet with Emma. "Your father saved my life," Dolores announced without preamble as she settled into the booth. "Took me 25 years to figure it out, but he saved my life that night." Emma looked puzzled, prompting Dolores to explain. "I was supposed to be on that same route, carrying a similar load for Westfield Logistics. But something about Jeremiah's radio call spooked me. The way his voice sounded, the desperation in it. I pulled over at the next truck stop and called in sick. Told dispatch I couldn't complete the run." The revelation that other drivers had been targeted added another dimension to Jeremiah's heroism. His final radio transmission had been more than a call for help. It had been a warning that had potentially saved other lives. 3 other drivers were scheduled for similar runs over the next 2 weeks, Dolores continued. All of us found excuses to avoid those assignments. Word travels fast on the CB channels when something doesn't feel right. Jeremiah's disappearance sent a chill through the entire trucking community. Emma realized that her father's death had ripple effects she had never considered. His sacrifice had not only exposed a criminal conspiracy, but had also protected other innocent drivers from falling into the same trap. The knowledge brought a bittersweet comfort, knowing that Jeremiah's final act had extended beyond his own situation to shield others from similar fates. Patricia Morrison called that evening with news that brought unexpected peace to both women. The Jeremiah Caldwell Memorial Scholarship had been established at UC Riverside's journalism school, funded by donations from truck drivers, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by the story. The scholarship would provide financial assistance to students pursuing investigative journalism, carrying forward Jeremiah's commitment to uncovering the truth regardless of personal cost. The response has been overwhelming, Patricia explained, her voice filled with wonder. We have received donations from all 50 states and 6 different countries. Truck drivers are organizing convoy fundraisers, and law enforcement agencies are making group contributions. Even some of the families of other victims have donated in Jeremiah's memory. Emma felt a surge of pride mixed with grief. Her father's story had touched people across the globe. inspiring a movement that extended far beyond their small family tragedy. The scholarship fund had already raised over $300,000, enough to support journalism students for decades to come. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "The International Brotherhood of Teamsters wants to establish safety protocols named after your father. The Caldwell standards would require trucking companies to report suspicious cargo manifests and unusual delivery instructions to a central database. They are also pushing for federal legislation to protect whistleblowers in the transportation industry." The idea that Jeremiah's death might prevent similar tragedies in the future brought a sense of meaning to his sacrifice that Emma had been desperately seeking. Her father hadn't just been a victim, he was becoming a symbol of integrity and courage that would inspire others to stand up against corruption and violence. "He always wanted you to get a good education," Patricia told her daughter. "I think he'd be proud that his story is helping other young people learn to ask the hard questions." The conversation continued for over an hour as mother and daughter discussed the strange new reality they inhabited. Patricia had become something of a celebrity in the victims' rights community, speaking at conferences and working with other families who had lost loved ones to organized crime. At 68, she had discovered a purpose and strength she never knew she possessed. "Robert's been wonderful through all of this," Patricia said, referring to her second husband. "He understands that I needed to see this through, needed to make sure Jeremiah's story was told properly. Not every man would be so understanding about his wife's dedication to her first husband's memory." Emma thought about the complexities of love and loss, how people could honor the dead while still embracing life with the living. Her mother had found a way to carry Jeremiah's memory forward while building a new life with Robert Morrison, a balance that required remarkable emotional maturity and strength. The weeks following Torino's arrest wrought a parade of revelations as federal investigators worked through evidence seized from his organization's properties. Safe houses in Nevada and Arizona had yielded documents dating back to the 1980s, revealing the scope of criminal activities that went far beyond drug trafficking. Special Agent Wells called Emma regularly with updates that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the criminal empire that had claimed her father's life. Money laundering operations had funneled cash through dozens of legitimate businesses, creating a web of complicity that reached into the highest levels of corporate America. Political corruption had enabled the organization to operate with virtual impunity for decades, with campaign contributions and bribes ensuring friendly treatment from prosecutors and judges. "We are looking at RICO charges against 17 different businesses," Wells explained during one of their conversations. "Construction companies, transportation firms, even a chain of truck stops. They were all either owned by Torino's organization or paying protection money to operate in their territory." The revelation that entire industries had been compromised added a new dimension to Emma's understanding of her father's death. Jeremiah hadn't just stumbled onto a drug operation, he had threatened to expose a criminal ecosystem that had infected legitimate commerce across the southwestern United States. More disturbing were the connections between Torino's organization and violent crimes that had previously been attributed to other causes. Missing persons cases, apparent suicides, and accidents involving potential witnesses all showed patterns that suggested systematic elimination of threats. The true body count would never be known, but investigators estimated that Torino's network had been responsible for over 100 deaths during its 30-year reign. Emma found herself struggling with the enormity of what her personal quest for answers had uncovered. What had begun as a daughter's search for closure had evolved into one of the largest organized crime investigations in American history. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, particularly when she considered the families of other victims who were just beginning their own journeys toward understanding and justice. Emma thought about her father's final weeks, when he had documented suspicious deliveries and gathered evidence despite growing awareness of the danger. Jeremiah Caldwell had been an ordinary man who found himself confronting extraordinary evil, and he had chosen courage over safety even when it cost him everything. The trial of David Torino began 6 months later in federal court in Los Angeles. Emma attended every day of proceedings, watching as prosecutors methodically presented evidence of crimes spanning 3 decades. The case had been assigned to Judge Martha Collins, one of the few federal judges whose integrity had never been questioned during the corruption investigation. The courthouse had become a focal point for media attention and public interest that extended far beyond the typical organized crime prosecution. Families of victims traveled from across the country to witness proceedings, many meeting for the first time despite their shared tragedy. The gallery was filled daily with truck drivers, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by Jeremiah's story. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Chen led the prosecution team with methodical precision, presenting evidence in a narrative that began with Torino's early involvement in organized crime and culminated with Jeremiah's murder. The opening statement alone took 2 hours, as Chen detailed the scope of the criminal enterprise and its impact on countless lives. David Torino built his empire on the systematic exploitation and elimination of innocent people, Chen told the jury during her opening statement. For 30 years, he used America's highways as corridors for drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder. When truck drivers like Jeremiah Caldwell threatened to expose his operations, Torino didn't hesitate to torture and kill them. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the criminal network structure and operations. Former associates who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors painted a picture of an organization that functioned with corporate efficiency, while maintaining absolute ruthlessness toward perceived threats. Financial experts explained complex money laundering schemes that had moved billions of dollars through legitimate businesses, corrupting entire industries in the process. Emma watched David Torino throughout the testimony, looking for some sign of remorse or humanity in the man who had tortured her father. But Torino's expression never changed, maintaining the same cold calculation that had served him for 30 years of criminal activity. His defense team, led by renowned criminal attorney Marcus Sullivan, had developed a strategy that acknowledged Torino's involvement in criminal activities while attempting to minimize his role in the most serious charges. My client was a mid-level operative in a criminal organization that extended far beyond his control, Sullivan argued during his opening statement. While we don't dispute that Miss Torino was involved in illegal activities, the prosecution's attempt to paint him as the mastermind of a vast criminal conspiracy is simply not supported by the evidence. The second week brought testimony from law enforcement officers who had worked on various aspects of the investigation. Detective Lieutenant Monica Reyes testified about the original missing persons investigation and the systematic misdirection that had prevented the truth from emerging for 25 years. Her testimony was particularly powerful when she described the frustration of knowing that important evidence was being suppressed, but being unable to determine the source of the interference. I knew from the beginning that something was wrong with the Caldwell case, Reyes testified. Every lead seemed to disappear, every witness developed selective amnesia, and crucial evidence kept getting misplaced. It wasn't until 25 years later that we understood why. The investigation was being sabotaged from within law enforcement. Special Agent Catherine Wells testified about the modern investigation and the discovery of Torino's criminal network. Her testimony included detailed explanations of surveillance operations, financial investigations, and the coordination between multiple agencies that had ultimately brought down the organization. Wells also testified about the threats against Emma Morrison and the hotel confrontation that had nearly resulted in additional murders. The most dramatic testimony came during the third week, when Richard Westfield took the stand. The former trucking company owner had aged dramatically since agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors, the weight of his complicity in multiple murders visibly crushing him. His testimony provided the jury with an insider's perspective on how the criminal organization had operated and the systematic way in which threats had been eliminated. I told myself I was just a businessman trying to survive, Westfield testified, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. But I knew what was happening to those drivers. I knew that people who asked too many questions disappeared. I could have stopped it, Could have gone to the authorities, but I was too scared and too greedy to do the right thing. Under cross-examination, Westfield broke down completely when Sullivan pressed him about his direct involvement in planning Jeremiah's murder. The courtroom fell silent as the elderly man sobbed uncontrollably, finally admitting that he had specifically recommended Jeremiah for the fatal run because he knew the driver was becoming suspicious. He was asking too many questions, Westfield whispered through his tears. David said we needed to eliminate the threat before it became a bigger problem. I gave them Jeremiah's schedule, his route preferences, even his CB radio call sign. I might as well have pulled the trigger myself. Emma found herself crying as she listened to Westfield's confession, not just for her father, but for the broken man on the witness stand who had allowed fear and greed to transform him into an accessory to murder. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with emotion as spectators processed the full horror of Jeremiah's betrayal by someone he had trusted. The fourth week brought testimony from forensic experts who detailed the evidence recovered from the burial site. Dr. Catherine Hayes explained the systematic nature of the burial and the professional expertise required to conceal a crime for 25 years. Her testimony included graphic descriptions of Jeremiah's injuries and the torture he had endured before his death. The victim suffered extensive trauma consistent with prolonged torture, Dr. Hayes testified. Broken ribs, fractured fingers, significant head trauma. These injuries were inflicted over a period of several hours, suggesting that the perpetrators were attempting to extract information through systematic violence. The testimony was difficult for Emma to hear, but she forced herself to listen to every detail. Her father had endured unimaginable suffering in his final hours, but he had apparently refused to provide information that might have compromised other innocent people. The knowledge of his courage in the face of torture added another layer to her already complex grief. Tommy Chen testified about the discovery of the buried truck and his grandfather's memories of the burial operation. The elderly construction worker, now 88, had been deemed too frail to testify in person, but his videotaped statement was played for the jury. His description of the professional nature of the burial operation supported the prosecution's argument that the murder had been carefully planned and executed by experienced criminals. The final week of testimony featured character witnesses and expert testimony about the broader impact of Torino's criminal organization. Families of other victims testified about their loved ones and the devastating impact of unresolved disappearances. Truck drivers spoke about the climate of fear that had pervaded the industry and the way drivers had modified their behavior to avoid becoming targets. Emma was called as a witness during the prosecution's case, testifying about her father's character and the impact his disappearance had on their family. Standing at the witness stand, looking directly at David Torino for the first time during the trial, she felt a strange sense of completion. My father was a good man who tried to do the right thing, Emma testified. He could have ignored what he was seeing, could have just driven his routes and collected his paychecks. Instead, he chose to stand up against people who thought they were above the law. His death wasn't meaningless. It was the beginning of a fight for justice that took 25 years to win. Torino's defense team called only a handful of witnesses, focusing on character testimony and attempting to establish that their client had been following orders from higher-ranking members of the criminal organization. But the strategy proved ineffective against the overwhelming evidence of Torino's direct involvement in planning and executing multiple murders. The closing arguments took 2 full days, with prosecutor Rachel Chen delivering a passionate summation that tied together the complex web of evidence into a compelling narrative of systematic criminality. Her final words to the jury were simple but powerful. David Torino built his empire on the bodies of innocent people. It's time to tear that empire down. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Emma felt a mixture of relief and emptiness as the verdicts were read, finally hearing the words she had waited 25 years to hear, but finding that they brought less satisfaction than she had expected. Emma watched David Torino throughout the testimony, looking for some sign of remorse or humanity in the man who had tortured her father. But Torino's expression never changed. maintaining the same cold calculation that had served him for 30 years of criminal activity. The guilty verdict was delivered on a Friday afternoon in spring, exactly 18 months after Jeremiah Caldwell's truck had been discovered beneath Interstate 40. David Torino was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on federal charges, with additional state sentences ensuring he would never see freedom again. As court officers led Torino away in shackles, he made eye contact with Emma for the first time during the trial. For just a moment, his mask of professional detachment slipped, and she saw something that might have been regret or acknowledgement. Then he was gone, disappearing into the federal prison system where he would spend the remainder of his life. Emma walked out of the courthouse into the California sunshine, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for 25 years. Justice had finally been served, not just for her father but for all the victims of Torino's criminal empire. The desert had given up its secrets, and the truth had prevailed despite decades of corruption and violence. The months following the conviction brought a strange period of adjustment for Emma. The intense focus that had driven her investigation gradually gave way to a broader perspective on her life and career. The book deal from the Los Angeles Times had evolved into something more meaningful, a comprehensive examination of how organized crime had infiltrated legitimate industries and the ongoing threat posed by criminal networks operating within legal businesses. The Vanished Trucker, A Daughter's Quest for Justice, became a bestseller within weeks of publication. But Emma donated all proceeds beyond her writing expenses to the Jeremiah Caldwell Memorial Scholarship and Victim Assistance Programs. The book's success led to speaking engagements across the country, where Emma found herself addressing audiences of law enforcement officers, journalists, and families of missing persons. At a conference in Phoenix, she met Margaret Santos, whose husband had disappeared while driving a load of electronics from California to Texas. The similarities to Jeremiah's case were striking. The suspicious cargo manifest, the company's evasive responses to questions, and the complete absence of evidence suggesting what had happened to the missing driver. "I always knew something was wrong," Margaret explained during their conversation. "But the police said Miguel had probably just decided to start a new life somewhere else, as if he would abandon his children and grandchildren without a word." Emma listened to similar stories from dozens of families, each representing a tragedy that might have been prevented if Jeremiah's warnings had been heeded. The pattern was always the same: drivers who asked questions, companies with suspicious connections, and law enforcement investigations that seemed to lose momentum despite obvious evidence of foul play. Working with Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults, Emma helped establish the Highway Guardian Project, a database designed to track suspicious disappearances of transportation workers and identify patterns that might indicate criminal activity. The project had already identified over 200 cases that warranted further investigation, suggesting that Torino's organization had been just one of several criminal networks using America's highways for illicit purposes. The success of the Highway Guardian Project led to federal legislation known as the Caldwell Act, which required trucking companies to report unusual cargo manifests and delivery instructions to a centralized database monitored by the Department of Transportation and the FBI. The legislation also established protections for whistleblowers in the transportation industry and mandated coordination between federal agencies when investigating suspicious disappearances of commercial drivers. Emma found deep satisfaction in knowing that her father's death had catalyzed systemic changes that would protect future drivers from similar fates. The irony wasn't lost on her that Jeremiah, who had died trying to expose a single criminal operation, had ultimately inspired reforms that addressed the broader problem of organized crime's infiltration of legitimate commerce. But the victory came with sobering knowledge about the fragility of justice and the ease with which evil could hide in plain sight. The investigation had revealed that criminal organizations could operate for decades within legitimate society, corrupting institutions and eliminating threats while maintaining facades of respectability. Amanda Torres, now 75, had become something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles, speaking at conferences about cold case investigations and the importance of never giving up on seemingly impossible cases. She and Emma had developed a close friendship built on their shared commitment to seeking justice for Jeremiah and other victims. "Your father would be amazed by what his story has accomplished," Torres told Emma during one of their regular lunches. "A truck driver from Riverside has inspired national legislation and international cooperation in fighting organized crime. That's a legacy most politicians would envy." The conversation took place at the same diner, where Patricia had worked double shifts while Jeremiah was on the road. The restaurant had installed a small memorial plaque near the entrance, honoring local residents who had lost their lives to violence. Jeremiah's name was at the top of the list, a permanent reminder of his sacrifice and the justice that had finally been achieved. Emma's relationship with her mother had evolved significantly during the investigation and trial. Patricia had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, becoming an advocate for victims' rights and a powerful speaker about the impact of unresolved crimes on families. Their shared journey toward justice had healed wounds that had festered for decades, replacing the helpless grief of uncertainty with the purposeful sadness of acceptance. "I used to dream about him every night," Patricia confided during one of their conversations. "Not good dreams, nightmares about what might have happened to him, where he might be suffering. But since the trial ended, I dream about the good times again. Our wedding day, Emma's birth, family vacations. It's like Jeremiah's spirit has finally been freed to rest in peace." The psychological impact of finally knowing the truth had been profound for both women. Emma had spent her entire adult life driven by unanswered questions, choosing careers and relationships based partly on her need to understand what had happened to her father. The resolution of that mystery had freed her to make choices based purely on her own desires and goals. She had accepted a position as senior investigative reporter with the Los Angeles Times, specializing in organized crime and public corruption. The work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, but it allowed her to honor her father's memory by continuing the fight against the kind of criminal networks that had claimed his life. The position also brought opportunities to work with law enforcement agencies on cold cases similar to her father's disappearance. Emma had developed expertise in recognizing patterns that might indicate criminal activity, and her unique perspective as both a victim's family member and a professional journalist made her valuable to investigators working on complex cases. One such case involved the disappearance of 3 truck drivers in the Pacific Northwest between 20. The circumstances were eerily similar to Jeremiah's case. Suspicious cargo manifests, evasive employers, and investigations that seemed to lose momentum despite obvious evidence of foul play. Emma's analysis of financial records and transportation patterns had helped FBI investigators identify a criminal network that was ultimately connected to remnants of Torino's organization. "It never really ends," Emma told Special Agent Wells during a consultation on the Northwest cases. "You take down one criminal network, and others emerge to fill the void. The important thing is that we are better at recognizing the patterns now, better at protecting potential victims." Wells, who had been promoted to Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Los Angeles office, nodded in agreement. "Your father's case changed how we investigate missing persons cases involving commercial drivers. We look for patterns now that we would have missed in. The Caldwell protocols have probably saved dozens of lives." The Caldwell protocols were investigative guidelines developed by the FBI for cases involving missing transportation workers. The protocols required immediate coordination between local and federal agencies, accelerated investigation of suspicious cargo manifests, and mandatory protection for witnesses who reported unusual transportation activities. The protocols had been adopted by law enforcement agencies across North America and had led to the early detection of several criminal operations before they could eliminate potential witnesses. Emma returned to mile marker 18-9. One final time, on the 2nd anniversary of the discovery that had changed everything. The construction project had been completed, and the highway now featured wider shoulders and improved sightlines that would prevent future accidents. A small memorial plaque had been installed near the original burial site, honoring Jeremiah Caldwell and the other victims of highway violence. The ceremony dedicating the memorial had drawn hundreds of attendees, including truck drivers from across the country, law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, and families of other victims who had found justice through the investigation that Jeremiah's death had inspired. Patricia and Robert Morrison had spoken at the ceremony, along with Emma and several of the investigators who had worked to solve the case. This memorial represents more than just one man's sacrifice, Patricia had said during her remarks. It represents the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. Jeremiah died believing that justice would eventually prevail, and this memorial proves that his faith was justified. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, holding countless secrets beneath its silent expanse. But this particular secret had been exposed to the light, and justice had finally been served. Emma placed a bouquet of wild flowers at the base of the memorial plaque and whispered a promise to her father that his story would continue to inspire others to seek truth, regardless of the personal cost. Standing alone at mile marker 89, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 25 years of questions had been answered, but the process had revealed that some mysteries are worth a lifetime of investigation. Her father's death had been a tragedy, but it had also been the beginning of a movement that would protect countless other innocent people from similar fates. The highway stretched ahead, carrying its endless stream of travelers across the landscape, where Jeremiah Caldwell had made his final journey. Most drivers passed mile marker 89 without knowing its significance, but some had heard the story and understood that they traveled on a road sanctified by sacrifice and redeemed by justice. As Emma drove away from mile marker 89, she understood that her father's legacy would endure long after the details of the investigation had faded from public memory. The reforms inspired by his death, the lives saved by improved safety protocols, and the families who had found closure through the Highway Guardian project, all testified to the enduring power of one man's decision to choose conscience over safety. The desert wind carried her final words away across the endless expanse of sand and stone. Rest in peace, Dad. Your fight continues, and justice will always remember your name. In the years that followed, Emma would return to mile marker 89 many times, sometimes alone and sometimes with other families seeking answers about their own missing loved ones. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for people touched by highway violence, a place where the living could commune with the dead and find strength to continue their own searches for truth. The desert that had claimed Jeremiah Caldwell's life had ultimately become the foundation of his greatest victory. A victory not just over the criminals who had killed him, but over the forces of corruption and indifference that had allowed such crimes to flourish in darkness. His voice, silenced in the fog 25 years earlier, would echo through the generations in every life saved by the reforms his death had inspired. The mystery of the vanished trucker had been solved, but the larger mystery of how ordinary people find extraordinary courage remained as relevant as ever. Somewhere on America's highways, other drivers faced similar choices between safety and conscience, and Jeremiah Caldwell's story would remind them that some fights are worth having, regardless of the cost, and that truth has a way of surfacing even from the deepest graves.